Hello, EELE 487 students. I hope that your work is going well in all of your classes in this online format, and I hope that you're enjoying covering some of the material that we're looking at here in our Ethics and Professionalism class. For this week, we are going to look at a topic that is not covered directly in our textbook, but I think it's something that you may have heard about already or something that you can learn about through various online sources. So in particular, on the D2L site, I've given you links to an introductory video and also a couple publications from IEEE Spectrum magazine from back in 2015 that talk about this topic. This is the Volkswagen emissions scandal. Now, if you're not familiar with this topic, what happened back in around 2014 is that VW cars that had diesel engines were being tested for a variety of reasons, and the test agency that looked into this discovered that when these cars were driving around on the road, they were emitting about 40 times the level of nitrous oxides that were allowed by government regulations. Now, these vehicles had been approved by the EPA during the testing for the vehicles, and so of course the question came up, well, why are these vehicles, when they're out on the road, emitting 40 times as much pollutants as they do when the EPA test is going on? So after looking into this, it pretty quickly became apparent to the regulators that there was something happening where the car's behavior would change between the test conditions and the driving on the road conditions. And they were suspicious of what is called a defeat device. And so this is firmware in the engine control computer that would somehow notice that a test was being conducted, and because of that it would suddenly become a very clean engine by switching on all of the pollution control devices. But as soon as the car recognized that it was not being tested, it would go back to being a polluting vehicle, because that would allow better gas mileage and greater performance, faster acceleration and so forth, to make the customer happy. So on the one hand, they would get by the regulation by passing the test, but then would sort of be deceptive in that the car actually was polluting a lot when it was out driving around. So you might wonder, well, how could the car determine that a test was going on? Well, it turns out that the EPA published how they did the testing, which was on a dynamometer. So the car was brought into a garage, the wheels were put up on essentially a treadmill for cars, and during the test, the steering wheel, for instance, was not being turned. So the firmware was designed to notice the special peculiar situations of the test. Steering wheel in one position, a certain profile of acceleration and so forth, and when the firmware detected this condition, it enabled the pollution control devices. Out on the road, when a driver was steering the car and other things were going on, the firmware noticed that it wasn't a test, and so it would go back to the high performance, high pollution state. Okay, so this was detected. Eventually VW did admit that in fact they had been doing this for years, and there were big fines and recalls and all kinds of things. So previously in this course, we've looked a lot at structural failure that we kind of blame on the mechanical engineers or the civil engineers, or we talked about software in devices where the programmer was intending to do well and then for whatever reason had poor requirements and so forth. Now in this case, this is a deliberate deception. So the firmware engineers involved at VW, the managers up into the high levels of the company knew about this, and essentially the engineers went along with this. And somehow they decided that breaking this law, the EPA regulations, was okay. And I'm curious what your thoughts about this are. So if you're looking at this case, why do you think the firmware engineers went along with that? They had to know when they're writing the software that they're detecting a test and then changing the performance of the device, that sort of went around the intent of the law, which was to reduce pollution in the environment. maybe they focused on just passing the test, that was their goal. And probably most important in our discussion is I'd like you to think about what you would do in a situation like this. If you became aware that your management wanted you to implement this firmware that was deliberately deceptive, would you go along with that yourself, as opposed to quitting your job? Apparently, in this case, nobody came forward as a whistleblower or alerted an ethics authority within VW that this was questionable. So again, it's an interesting case, and this week I'd like you to look at the videos, read the background information, and then jump into the discussion and kind of give some ideas on how you might approach this kind of topic if it did come up. What would you do if you were involved in something that might be a workaround to a regulatory matter? Okay, I look forward to your discussion comments, and again, please read your classmates' comments and feel free to jump in and respond to those and go from there. Thank you.